The floor is yours. Just bring up anything you want. Anything, even if it's just marginally relevant. Ma'am, you raise your hand, sir.
So, mini story followed by the bulk of my question. So, I took my first ecology, full ecology class just a few years ago, and we started doing these little field trips where we'd go and collect little bugs and bring them back and try to figure out what species they were. And even for our class, who was in the sciences, it was just really, really hard to figure out what species they were.
Yeah.
And there were all these differences in size and color, and they seemed basically the same, but the teacher knew the difference, but we couldn't figure out the difference to save our lives, even for a whole semester. So, that being said, when you say that we should know all the species in whatever ecosystem we're working on.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Then,
as much as you can. Yeah.
But also all the species in the world. So it just seems like this is
too much.
A task that requires a lot of specialized training for a lot of different people who will stay there and keep tracking it for a really long time. So I understand the importance of it, but I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions on where we're going to find all these people and how we're going to fund them, because everyone wants to fund cancer research now.
I think you had the wrong professor. Also, you were a little ahead of the curve here, and the curve is the technology I just stated. We are now passing the age of field guides, traditional field guides, where you see a kind of bird, you open it up, you flip through, or we have field guides for moths, for beetles, for all sorts of things. And but you're quite right in this sense. If you had to really get anything beyond just a small number of species in your repertoire, you would need to have a whole library, and you're too busy to deal with it at that level. But now we are in a wholly different era of being able to identify almost anything that's known to science quickly by comparisons. Eventually, as I said, or soon, it's already the case for trees and shrubs. Just take a specimen and show it to a scanner of some kind, and it comes up with the name, and then quickly afterward will come up with everything known about that species. So this would be, I think, an entirely different ambiance of if you'd had that facility, which now you all will have, or you soon will have. Meaning, when you take students out, if you have, or you take a research group out, or you go out on your own project, you'll be able to say, what is this little spider that seems to be this here now everywhere, spinning webs and so on. Then you just photograph the specimen, you can quickly get the name of it, and then quickly get everything known about it. And you can figure out, yes, I think I know why it's so abundant now. Or if this is highly unusual for this species, and you're off and running. In terms of, and that will allow you to accumulate knowledge pretty fast. But I was just suggesting, in addition, that you have a pet group, or consider having a pet group. Like scarab beetles. Well, they're very, very nice. They're colorful. They're beautifully sculptured. You can overlook the fact that they breed in dung, or you can have butterflies or whatever, as just a group that you think you find interesting. This is what birders do. We have no problems with birds, identifying them, going through life cycles, knowing exactly what their status is, and so on. I'm often approached, I'm often queried by the fact that there may be 8 million, 10 million species, shall we say, of eukaryotic organisms as you can visually see. And that's just too many for people to handle generally. How can people have interest in 10 million species? It's simple. If we produce the kind of humanity we hope will evolve, with a kind of education, with a kind of interest in their environment that we hope people will develop, then, and we have 10 billion people, 10 billion species. If I've got my math right, we have potentially 1,000 people for every species of beetle, every species of salamander, and so on, and out of that 1,000, surely there are a couple of them that are true stewards. This is in the human genome. You would be astonished, maybe you already know about it, how many groups and clubs there are studying special groups of insects, even in this age of ignorance about biodiversity. We have not just birders, but we have now a substantial and growing group of odonatologists, odonata, dragonflies and damselflies. I recently went to an odonata society meeting in New England, thinking there would be, 3 or 4 people we could sit around and chat. The room was filled. People were coming in with their collections. They were telling war stories, about, I went 3 times to that marsh in early April when it should have been there, and it was only the last time I saw 2 of that species, that rare endangered thing. People get enthusiastic. If there are people in America, and there are a lot of them who collect bottle caps, then there are going to be people who are thrilled by the variety and the beauty of skeletid beetles. Well, so I think that's a problem that begin to take care of itself. And all I do is recommend that you do something, you have that awareness, you make use of the tool, particularly when you're teaching, and keep up with the technology, and things will change, I think, pretty quick. Well, then you did raise another real important question. How can we get jobs for people who want to make careers of this? And we badly need the people, and we badly need the jobs for them. And I'm not quite sure. One way that occurred to me was to come down to Duke University and hold a seminar with graduate students in which I could preach the gospel. So, I just hope that it would become increasingly obvious that this is what we need to do. Right now, the world is going green, but for some crazy reason, it's green for the most part, only about the non-living environment. We're all fired up over climate warming, about using up non-replaceable natural resources, about pollution, all these things. Joe Sixpack in Topeka can get fired up about the non-living environment. We sort of lost interest in the living environment. I'm talking about the rest of life. I said biodiversity, the rest of life. We just lost interest in it. So once it picks up, I think there will be a momentum behind this. In biology and science, I think in the conservation movement and so on. You're supposed to be doing all the talking, but I couldn't resist. Let's come up with another one here, and then we'll move on. Go on.
So I have
you can talk to the rest, because I want to hear the discussion.
I have a very fundamental problem with the species concept. And I'm a birder, and I also study birds. So when you go out to the field with your binoculars, you identify the birds. And we have it easy because birds are easier. They're well studied and well known. But now, very recently, in the recent 10 years, molecular biology has come into taxonomy. And with birds, of course, lots of people study birds. So each taxonomist is running molecular experiments and discovering that there are, instead of 1, 10 species of spine tail, and they're all like brown and dab and have like one little thing that when you're in the field in the rainforest trying to see through your binoculars, doing an inventory of a reserve or trying to see how important it is for conservation, you can't see that little thing that they can see, well, either on a skin or they can see in the genome, but we can't see with our eyes. So for me, it's very controversial in like using the species concept. So species are separated themselves in the environment, but some of the things that separate them we can't identify with our human eye. But then again, we use the species concept to define, to like understand ecosystems and also to define what's important for conservation. So I don't know if we should keep like just separating species according to just genetics and just lab work and being able, like, yeah, these are definitely different, but when you try to make that practical into the study of species, you can't, because you can't see the difference. So we end up with like 20 species of tapaculos, which are like this secretive, tiny black birds that all look the same. I promise, they all look the same. And it's so hard. And so I don't know like how far we should go with just like dividing species. Molecular biology is just on the momentum right now, and they just like want to split everything, and it's making our life really hard on the ground. I don't know what you all think about that, or if you.
Well, let me make a comment, if I might. I was hoping you'd pick up on this, but it's easy. You just learn the other species. I mean, all the species. And if you go in the field, you take more than a binocular. You take a DNA sequencer. And then, in addition, you look for certain things. I mean, I know in the case of ants, we have sibling species like that, you know. And often in the behavior, you can tell small differences. In the song, and so on. But you're dead right. It means that there's a number, I mean, in the difficulty. But this is just, to my mind, it's taxonomy or biodiversity studies entering fully the modern age. We should know what every one of those species is, and you should be able to identify them when you go out, one way or the other. Granted, you can't do it now, but you will soon. Yeah. What do you think?
I'm just wondering if you could almost have two branches of taxonomy, where you have the molecular biology side versus the natural history side, and you can branch off the schematic of the whole thing in some way.
No.
You just can't do it that way.
No. You know as well as I do that what looks like a formidable technology now that you need to master in order to do some simple thing is always modularized. That is to say, the technology evolves so that finally a child can do it, and even a graduate student. Let me give you an example. Let me give you an example. When electron microscopy, which was invented back in the 30s, I think, when it finally arrived in the biological laboratories, oh my, you know, this was the thing. Everybody wanted whatever they were working on, you know, they had to get an electron micrograph of it. And in order to do it, we had to have a special EM laboratory with a technician working. And you went and consulted with a technician, and you had them do the preparation and so on. Well, it got easier and easier, and finally it's ended up on the desk of, graduate students, or at least in the lab for everybody to use. Electrophoresis. Oh my. You know, when that first came in, that was the big thing. And we had to have a whole new school of electrophoresis, you know, for people who wanted to work on genetic variation. Now it's so routine. At any rate, it doesn't matter, because in terms of genetics, it's already being replaced by DNA sequencers. DNA sequencers. Oh, goodness. You know, when it began, the triumph of the human genome, or the first bacterial genome published in Nature. Now you can do a bacterial genome with a really small instrument in couple of hours for next to nothing cost. So that's what's going to happen.
Hopefully soon.
Promise you. Keep talking. I'm sorry. I keep
Well, I
interrupting
have a
you.
related question, and we've come up to it through Natalia's question and through your discussion of this idea that one might be a lumper or a splitter. Do you consider yourself more of a lumper or a splitter, and how do you see that as important to conservation and defining what we have on Earth?
It's a trivial matter. The reason is that the important thing is to have a descriptive framework. And lumping and splitting among taxonomists usually means not how many species you distinguish. I think we just made note, that we now have the technology to do much better, particularly with symmetric species. But we'll also use these modern techniques for ones that are allopatric, that is in different areas. But the lumping and splitting problem typically comes in when you're dealing with genera. But once you have a phylogeny worked out, whether or not you have just, you like to slice and dice the twigs of the phylogenetic tree relatively finely and have a different genus for each one, or more families or less, is mostly a semantic matter. I think that won't be a big problem. It's a problem, but it won't be the kind of thing that's going to bring anything to a halt, in my opinion. Disagree with me. Come on.
Do you think it has implications for conservation in defining how many species there are? Say 10 versus 2?
No. No. I think that, well, when you go into an ecosystem, you're going to have a certain number of species. And you're not going to have that kind of problem that you run into when you go from one part of country, from the Carpathians to the Alps, and you have something that looks very similar, and you turn out they're different. And you're not going to have that kind of problem when you're working with one ecosystem. So that you can live with uncertainties when you're dealing with an ecosystem. You actually can use, if the taxonomy, the classification hasn't been worked out for, say, some copepod or nematode worm and so on, that's very important in your ecosystem, or just as there in your ecosystem, you can use a morphospecies. And you can have reference specimens, and as soon as the classification gets better worked out, then that gets a name onto it.
But I think a lot of species conservation people would disagree, because, like, if you have, say, the Endangered Species Act, right? And you have a species that's under the Endangered Species Act, and then they find out that it should be lumped with another species that's more common, and that species loses its conservation status, and we know immediately people are going to stop conserving it, because that's what people do. So that's like a real concern, say, in islands, if they have a species that's endemic and it's the reason for conservation, or they're a hotspot because of those endemic species, and then they get lumped, then conservation is like, well, we shouldn't put money into that anymore because it's not endemic, it's not going to go extinct. But it's so I would say, like, lots of people would just disagree with how, like, it is important for conservation. But
I didn't say that, but I mean, you're right. What you're saying is right, but I didn't mean to say that, because you're looking at, I think the word for it these days is extremist. Mm-hmm. I'd say save them all.
Yeah, I agree.
Stand fast, save them all. I'm going to take that subject up next session on stand fast. Stop the Anthropocene. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. Okay, but please. But no, you make a very good point. That is a problem in practice as it is today.
So I don't know if this will come out as a question, but we've been talking about birds, so I'm wondering if we could talk about bees. So I'm currently working on trying to understand sort of the role of organisms that are crossing between human and sort of what we've been talking about, which sort of idealistically I think sounds more like undisturbed wild ecosystems in their wild state. But there are sort of many situations where you have in the case of bees, organisms that are not only have their wild cousins, but have been cultivated and corralled and maintained by people for a purpose for thousands of years, that have co-evolved or outcompeted some of their native varieties, and now are sort of, I think, becoming more charismatic as we look at real problems of whether it's colony collapse disorder or the maintenance of global agricultural systems that no longer have willing workers to maintain their pollination. So I don't know if you could talk a little bit about, or I'm just curious to hear about what people think regarding sort of species in this domain, which are sort of crossing back and forth and may not, I don't know, the taxonomic interest may not keep up with what is becoming more of a homogeneous.
Are you speaking about alien species?
Well, I'm looking.
Or are you speaking about domesticated species that become feral?
Domesticated species that become feral, or that, for example, like I do field work in Mexico, and you have, both a native variety of bees that is no longer sort of.
When you say bees, are you talking about honeybees?
Honeybees in particular.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah. Well, in theory, that's a problem. In reality, I don't see it as a great problem. I mean, we're learning one thing about introduced species, incidentally. Introduced species, the number alien species, is in every country, and therefore the whole world is going up exponentially. We're having alien species just pouring in. And that is a problem. But we're also finding out that most alien species are adapted to marginal environments, the kind of habitats in their native land, marginal riverbanks, open, bare areas, weedy areas, or unstable grasslands, all these things, floodplains. And when they get here, a large number of them go to those habitats. A good example is the fire ant, the imported fire ant. Studied by Walter Schinkel at FSU showed that when he planted fire ant colonies in the middle of longleaf pine forest understory, which has a rich native ant fauna. He just planted them. And they did well for a while anyway. They didn't disturb the native species around them. And other studies have shown that the imported fire ant is a specialist on open area. Give them a choice and they'll pick a highway strip or an old dirt road every time over a natural forest. It isn't, the alien species is not as bad a problem as it might seem at first. But on the other hand, a certain number of those alien species are going to prove dangerous. Myconia, the favored horticultural plant, a favored horticultural plant around the world, had beautiful leaves and stems. When introduced into French Polynesia, escaped and grew into forest, big trees almost, that grow so close together they shut out everything, every plant species, every animal species. The famous brown tree snake, introduced species, introduced into Guam shortly after the Second World War by accident. It might have just sort of been around as just another introduced vertebrate species, but no, because it's a specialist on nestling birds, and it had no enemies. It spread throughout the forest of Guam and ate every bird, every songbird. I don't mean every species, every bird, leaving Guam silent. That's a subject that Stuart Pym here has done a lot of work on. And so we find a few of these monstrous species. I'm dealing with one now that is keeping an eye on one. It's called the little fire ant, Wasmania auropunctata. It's a native of the Amazon, and because it's adapted to rainforest where it's been introduced, it's really a serious problem because it doesn't stay in marginal habitats, but it goes right into the native, otherwise undisturbed forest. And New Caledonia, for example, which I just visited recently, it's spreading through the forest and taking out everything. Other ant species, invertebrates, making a desert of the leaf litter of otherwise relatively undisturbed rainforest. So I guess we have to take it case by case. And you've raised this business of introgression between introduced strains that go feral, like the honeybee, the Africanized honeybee, and yeah, that's a problem, but it's not a problem that comes up sufficiently, and it tends to be limited to species that are not native anyway. The Apis mellifera is a native of Africa, which in earliest times, Neolithic times probably, spread from Africa into Europe and has been spread around the world. So it's not native here anyway, but it is affected by Africanized bees that breed with it. But it's not anything as serious as a introduced species. Of course, feral animals are an enormous menace. Cats on Johnson Island, until they were wiped out and the fauna and flora could return. I think rats on one of the small islands of the Seychelles, which had native plants and animals being wiped out completely, eliminated, and back came the fauna and flora. Swine, wild pigs in Hawaii, such a great menace to everything that there are professional pig hunters. Say, there's a job opportunity for you. If you like to stay in the outdoors. I've netted on too long. Please continue.
Those examples seem to go in support of the claim that nature isn't fragile, which I know you immediately take issue with.
I'm sorry, who said this?
Those examples of removing an invasive species and everything kind of coming back in full.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Would be an example of nature being fairly resilient. Or put in the negative, not fragile, which you've taken issue with, and I would, and quite a few people do, but others don't so much. And I mean, there are examples of whole islands being, kind of hodgepodge mixes of species from every continent and exist in their own beauty or symbiosis or whatnot. I guess it's my personal questioning the fragility of nature and the need to keep things separate. How would you formulate that in policy? I don't know that you could.
Please do, and write a paper, will you? But
Absolutely.
I don't know about how you feel, because I want to get more talk. I've been talking too much. But this is definitely a situation where each example is unique. So if you have an island with a number of striking endemics in the plants and a few animals and so on, and there is a predator that can eliminate virtually all the animals or drive them to near extinction and start reducing the or changing the vegetation radically or something of this sort. These are cases where if you remove that one source that's creating the disequilibrium, you know, that is changing everything, then it can come back because everything else has remained pretty much the same. The potential is there. It's not necessarily due to resilience of the species, but there's so many cases, as you well know, where the surrounding environment is, and the original environment is so complex that certain species in it are already scarce, and they require particular conditions. And if those are removed by any means whatsoever, they can drop very quickly to extinction. Bachman's warbler probably went because it didn't have enough overwintering ground and left in the Isle of Youth off Cuba. We're pretty sure the ivory-billed woodpecker went because we cut out all the cypress, you know, all the bottomland big trees it requires. And I've spent time in red-cockaded woodpecker country, which is a wonderful example of this. You've got to have fairly big longleaf pine for these nests of a particular kind to be built in order for that species to continue. And when those are reduced, like the ivory bill, the red-cockaded woodpecker goes down. They have to be rescued. So case by case, I'd take it. I don't think there's any generalization that we can draw at this time. But if you can, work on it, will you?
Sure.
I mean, yeah, work on it. Yeah.
I don't know if there is, but I also agree that nature, you know, like some cases are fragile, but it's a kind of a fact that conservation's had to focus on like species that they can prove that are fragile,
Right.
to like get them to like have an action towards conservation, which is worrying because everyone's just worried about what's about to go extinct. The rest can like recover somehow because they always do, you know, the forest grows back. So it's a big problem, like trying to justify conservation for like a prairie, for instance. People or savannas. People are like, oh, that's just grass. It's like okay to just like plant palm, you know, like oil palm on it. So.
Well, it's protecting for the sake of itself,
Right.
which I guess is the big, big divergence. Can you protect something for the sake of itself, or does it need to have a use or benefit in order to actualize the protection of it? I mean, philosophically, it'd be great to say, well, for the sake of itself, you know. But there's a bottom line. I don't know if that's the reason why so often it needs to be for human benefit or have some purpose. But
Yeah. You just stated the fallacy of the Anthropocene.
Right.
You stated, I don't believe you believe it, but you just stated it.
well, I'm not sure I believe it either.
I mean, if we require a measurable benefit for human beings for every species that we save, make any effort to save, then the bottom is going to drop out of world biodiversity.
And that's where the problem's happening right now. Everybody is, like you just said, is on that side of the fence. And I think it's the way that we're all thinking about it that's wrong. I mean, just like you said, we're all looking at how certain species that we're looking at has a benefit. Well, every species has a benefit. We just may not know what the benefit is, but we have to understand that there is a benefit. That's why it's here.
But part of the result is just, part of the issue I take is just looking for a benefit. Why does it have to have a benefit? Why do we need to know the benefit in order to protect it?
Exactly.
And then there's, you know, do you do it on a species level, or do you say, okay, the savanna has a benefit, and so we protect the savanna as opposed to protecting the grasses and the trees, insects and the buffalo, right? So there are different levels of it, but you know, if you take issue with the Anthropocene as a concept, then you're not taking issue with the fact that we can't identify the benefit, but that in order for it to be protected, there has to be a benefit. It's a distinction.
It's a deep moral problem. Yes.
Now we're back to the guts of it, and it's a moral problem. And what's worth considering, I think, is to refigure the whole thing in terms of moral reasoning. And to see if we should not have a better precept just for the greater security of our own species. Right now, we are a dysfunctional species. The way I like to put it, we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And the godlike technology is run amok. The use of it is run amok because of we are driven by emotions that evolved in a wholly different kind of environment, and they are under regulation and channeling the use of this technology by inadequate, outdated institutions. And so recognizing, if we can recognize that we still are a dysfunctional species, and that's basically what our problem is, then maybe what we should be doing is setting upon a program of deliberate, long-range thinking, and setting goals that could be put in a moral context. That's going to be hard in a country where 40% of the people, the evangelicals, think that the earth is soon to end and we're with a second coming. But it is the way we should be thinking, and maybe we can come out with and that's where you come in. You really should be doing this. You should be thinking about this. You should be writing about it. The moral reasoning, the physician's code, you shall do no harm. If we could somehow, by recognizing what we are and who we are and why we act the way we do and what effect we're having, and start trying to think farther into the future, if we could have a basic tenet which would be overarching, like do no harm to the rest of life, or to do no avoidable harm to the rest of life, we really need to be talking about this moral issue. Do we have anyone here who's thinking about getting into moral philosophy? Or, okay, I got one, ecological tenets of ecological practice and conservation, moral reasoning connected with it.
That's very much where my thoughts lie.
Yeah, well,
That.
all right.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I just say, please think about getting into that game, would you?
Does that kind of tenet, do no harm, go against our creation by our biological necessities or instincts? Is that something a species can do to set out to do no harm?
Well, we have been so unique in so many ways already. Why not try one more? Which is, and then why not try to develop a moral structure and a tenet which stops us in the current progress of destroying most of the rest of life on the planet. That's what we're doing. Yes, ma'am.
So something that struck me as we've been talking today is a lot of these solutions that we think might be really useful seem sort of long-term or that they're coming. So in response to Natalia's question, maybe one day we may have these portable DNA sequencers, but that is still, it's coming certainly, but it might still be a while away. Or to get enough specialists in taxonomy, we probably need to start, teaching children at a young age to appreciate nature so that they grow up to want to do these things, or that we have enough of them to demand funding. But then you can't just decide to change public school education, for example. I mean, there's a whole series of telling them what needs to be on the agenda in schools, and this is also a really long process. And then cultivating a new moral code for all humans is a very, very long process, it sounds to me. And if we knew how to do that, I mean, maybe a lot of problems could already be solved, because we could just tell people everything you're doing is wrong and horrible, and then they change. But so I was really interested in what we can do before this whole huge evolution of making everyone into naturalists can happen. And one thing I thought was really cool in the books was these like bio blitz days where you go out and like collect all the species and everyone's really into it. But I'm just wondering if anyone else has ideas about like interim things that we can do that sort of go towards this goal, but that we don't necessarily need to wait for this big revolution in morality to happen.
I can help a little bit maybe on that. I think it goes to the adults of the children who are spending so much time trying to make a living and working that they have to balance their time and take a kid fishing, get outside, get connected with nature in some form or fashion, other than the schools doing the bio blitzes, that it comes down to the family piece. Because if the child is going to most connect to their family, and if the family can get outside and start to connect in beautiful ways, then it's just going to permeate through the child's mind, and that just becomes part of society.
And how do you convince
Right,
the
well-
parents that they
Right,
should be doing
and that's the
this?
hard part. That's
Does
the piece that-
anybody else have any ideas? Because there's some of us here, you haven't spoken up. Because this is something I'm sure all of you here have thought of.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think, like many people here, the reason I'm interested in the natural environment was opportunities that my parents gave me to go out in nature, go fishing, hiking, experiences like that. I think they're extremely formative. And I think that's a good thing to play up and play off of in a lot of these communities. A lot of these evangelical communities are rural ones, and people are connected to the land there. They can understand that. But I think it's also extremely difficult. Last night there was a debate with Bill Nye, creationism versus evolution. Why are we still having this debate? I mean, I kind of took even issue with the debate happening in the first place, because it kind of gives equal standing to both of them. But you have schools in Texas, where science textbooks are reflecting intelligent design. I mean, I think these are, that is just unacceptable. Like, you can't have that. You don't protect what you don't care about, and if you don't know it or understand it, you're not going to care about it.
Yeah, that's true.
I think if there's something that I think is very immediate that we could do as a scientific community, it's at the policy level to have more scientists involved in policy. I find that scientists want policies to change to support conservation and to support science education and things like this. But I have not yet met a scientist who is willing to run for even a local office, who is willing to take a leadership position and actually be the person who could institute some of these changes. I spent a lot of time in DC lobbying to people who cared very much about things because they had a personal connection, they loved it or they thought it was beautiful, but who really didn't understand it and who really weren't scientists. How much easier would it be if I could go and lobby to someone who said, oh yeah, I was an environmental science major in undergrad, and I did my graduate degree at Yale School of Forestry, and I absolutely will support your bill. It's hard to find because it's hard to find scientists who are willing to step outside of their comfort zone and take on positions of leadership outside of science.
So I just have a question to that, because
absolutely.
I've heard that same argument many times, and I've actually wondered myself, and I can't even come to a conclusion, because a lot of people say that scientists need to be advocates of what they're studying, but then, or at least, they need to step outside of the lab and do something about what they're studying rather than just publishing. But then a lot of people worry that once a scientists take a stand, then they're not unbiased anymore, and then anything they do from then on, maybe people will suspect, or even if it's not valid, they can spin it that way.
Right, so I would have a couple of responses to that. One, what I'm suggesting is not necessarily that every scientist become an advocate. I don't think that's realistic. Everybody has different skills and is good at different things, but I think to inculcate a sense of leadership and a little bit of civic responsibility within the scientific community so that people who are able to take on positions of leadership and advocacy do so and are celebrated for doing so and aren't shut out of the community and aren't shut away from academic careers and things like that. So that's one. And then two, I think that we have a special mandate in some ways because we are conservationists. It is a value-driven science in a lot of ways. I don't necessarily think that that conflicts or calls into question any of our science any more than medical doctors advocating for the eradication of malaria calls into question the medical research that takes place surrounding malaria. So I don't think that it has to be a conflict in any ways. I don't think it has to be an assignment for every single person to take on, but I do think it is a responsibility and a mandate that we have as conservation biologists. And if we want to really move things forward, we're just talking in circles if we just sit here and talk to each other about values that people should have or things that they should do. The question is, what can we do now? And this is absolutely one of them. I mean, on the smallest scale, run for the Duke Young trustee position, sit on the board, sit on the endowment board as an advisor, say, hey, I think we should think about environmentally responsible endowment investments. Say, I think we should think about, the way that Duke manages its properties. Let's see if there's ways that we can make that more green. Everyone can participate, start small, and then,
So I have a point to make on that. Like, I also think that when policy gets made, so my research is in Appalachia with mountaintop removal mining, and a lot of decisions are getting made about what level of stream conductivity should be allowed. And even if you're not an advocate, if you have science that you have produced, you can submit that science to decision-making panels so that they are actually taking that into an advisement. And I think that that is not being an advocate. That's just saying, this is the science that I've done, and how does this bear on the decision that you're getting ready to make? Because if that is not actually being put out there, then a decision is going to get made that's not including any of the science. So, and that's, I think, a very minimal amount of effort that needs to be done to do that. So.
We're drawing toward a close, but I'd, on this matter, first of all, of the propriety, properness of scientists speaking up on moral issues, I want to just name several scientists who became strong advocates and very effective, and at the same time retained and gained recognition as scientists, true, real scientists, and so honored and recognized as such. Peter Raven, director of the Missouri Botanical Garden. Stuart Pym, Duke University. Until he became too political, Paul Ehrlich. And I haven't suffered a lot either. I think that you can do it. And I think that you're completely right. Those who care should do it. The others, you don't have to. But if you're in a position to do it, and you should not despair, because major change, what you just said, I have to disagree with just one point. Major change can come fast. I'm reminded that when the Maori discovered that when acquiring guns, they were killing each other off at too fast a rate, abandoned guns. Same with the Japanese, the shogunate Japanese, and with the nuclear bomb, we've gradually, it took a while, but we've essentially moved now to a period where national wars are almost over. Rachel Carson, one stroke and changed the nation. I think, too, in doing this, that we should be among ourselves encouraging people from the humanities to come in and get them involved. We have people like Barbara Kingsolver now and Margaret Atwood who are keen in the conservationists. Let's get them, or hope that they will become spokesmen. You can reach a large audience and you can change people's thinking, sometimes pretty quick. Look how quickly we changed about pesticides and pollution of the environment. Look how much the BP oil spill did to wake us up. We need to be wakened. The whole human population, Americans and so on, have to be wakened to the crisis of biodiversity depletion. That was why I wrote this book, The Creation, and why I spent a substantial amount of time talking with religious leaders. I found a lot of them, even evangelicals, ready immediately to agree if they hadn't already begun to think like this. Even evangelicals who think maybe that the world is going to end in 10 years, they were thinking, well, that's not what God intended. This is God's in creation. We haven't begun to explore this. Multiple avenues of changing world opinion. And so much depends on you. Because unless the experts and the developing professionals able to get jobs, maybe not right in the area you wanted to be, if vis-a-vis conservation of biodiversity, but certainly where you have authority and prestige and you are articulate, you can do a lot. I think on that good Southern Baptist altar call, I will call this meeting to a close, and we can get together again on Friday. And I propose to talk then about the Anthropocene.